we intuitively believe that the ego is the center of the subject. And what do I mean by the subject? By the subject, I mean the totality of your consciousness and unconsciousness. So if you think of that as a whole circle, well, then that's what we consider ourselves to be the center of. We consider the ego the I. I am at the center of my being. So you think of all different parts of you as being around that center of the circle. But this is a miscomprehension. Joseph Campbell, in the Power of Myth series with Bill Moyers, gives a great explanation and a great illustration of what the center of the self really is. And this is drawing on Jung's idea of the self with a capital S, and it's the higher self in some sense. And the structure of the self in this idea is, if you take that circle and you cut off the top of it, maybe the top third to be generous, and you put a dot in the center of that top part of the circle, that would be the ego. That dot would represent the ego, and that top slice would represent ego consciousness, would represent everything that's within consciousness. But if you take the circle as a whole and you put the dot in the center of the whole circle, then that is the center of the subject. So that is the self in terms of the unconscious and the conscious. So we see that the conscious in this illustration is just the tip of the iceberg. And if you take the entire iceberg, then you find that the center is much deeper underwater. And that's what we're talking about here. It's the revolutionary idea that Jung had, that consciousness is not the center of the being. That consciousness is merely the crest of the wave. It's the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what's going on in the psyche. And so we have this misconception because all we have access to is our consciousness. And so because we're constantly reinforcing that, and because ego is so important in the development of civilization and the development of, even in our law code and responsibility, you think of the fall being down to having free will. Well, that's all connected into consciousness and the importance of ego. So we have, in some senses, rightly built that strong barrier to believe that we are the center of the self. But as we grow and mature, we have to come to realize that we are not the center of the being. And you realize this when if you've ever been undermined by some drive in you, if you've ever been depressed, if you've ever been anxious, if you've ever tried to go on a diet and failed, if you've ever tried to take up an exercise regime and failed, then you realize that there are other forces working within you. And just because your consciousness says it, it doesn't mean that that's the way it's going to go. And so this is the revolutionary idea that maybe we can connect to that thing in the center, and rather than succumbing to the things, to the bubbling unconscious, to this id energy, there might be something else down there. And this something else for Jung is the self. And the self is the higher parts of ourselves, the wisdom that lies in the unconscious, the thing that gave birth to ego in the first place. And that's a very important point. Where did consciousness come from? If not from some deeper unconscious source. It's that island emerging from the ocean of unconsciousness. And so what if there's something deeper? What if there is a deeper other type of consciousness? And you could connect this in with the book of Genesis. And we see that in Genesis, God creates light. Let there be light. A few days before he creates the sun. So there's a light of consciousness before there is the sun, which is the idea of ego consciousness. So there is some kind of unconscious consciousness, to put it in some kind of oxymoronical form, whereas the sun is created a few days later, and that's the ego consciousness. That's the I, the thing that starts to have this self-narrative to saying I am this, I am that, and identifying with things. But there's something deeper, and that deeper thing, which is the matrix out of which consciousness emerges, that is the true source of consciousness, and that is the true center of the being. And that's a really revolutionary idea, and I think it's one we haven't even begun to come to terms with. I think with advances in neuroscience and advances in everything that we've learned from psychoanalysis, I think that it's beginning to emerge. But it's a revolutionary idea. It's as revolutionary, I would say, as Nietzsche's God is dead, because it's it's turning the world on its axis. It's turning everything we know about ourselves on its head. So I think that's an interesting thing, an important message. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and as ever, please subscribe, give us a like. I'd love to hear any thoughts or insights you have down in the comments, and otherwise I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.